Have you ever wondered why the American zeitgeist rallies around the idea of individualism so intensely? Why is it so crucial that people should be accountable for pulling themselves out of the situations they were dealt? This sort of unapologetic individualism is used to justify why people live in poverty and others live so lavishly. What if this ideal is not necessarily about the individual, but a way to sell identities championed by society to its participants? Identities that can make the lucky few wealthy, but only after they have subscribed to their seller's identity, molding themselves around it and using it to legitimize their social value. This analysis attempts to uncover the use of individualism and its malicious intentions to circumvent individuals from ownership and true self-identification in American society. By stripping the paint of consumption and neoliberalism plastered on by the proverbial paint roller of capitalism, I hope to reveal a portrait of the individual, how its existence is threatened by individualism, and maybe instill some hope by the end of this video. So when did this all start? When did individualism become this prolific entity that coerced people to believe that their actions and outcomes are completely their responsibility, no matter what situation they were born into? I think we could go back in time to any period of human civilization and see how individuals interacted with their environment and society. But in this case, I think it's important to talk about individualism through a post-industrial economic lens and paint a full picture before discussing its relationship outside of these confines. Because in this context, the idea of the individual is really about capital. It's about making money, taking care of yourself, and pulling yourself up in a system where the odds are manufactured to make it improbable for most people. So if we're going to critique this idea, we're going to have to do it through that lens. And that brings us to Karl Polanyi, because he attempts to flesh out individualism as more than a concept. He shows how it was born out of the rise of free markets and how that shift changed everything. Karl Polanyi was an Austro-Hungarian anthropologist, sociologist, and political thinker who approached these disciplines through an economic lens. He was a prominent socialist who focused on economics and social relations as tools to understand the rapidly industrializing world around him. Published in 1944, his most well-known work, The Great Transformation, introduces foundational concepts like the double movement and the embedded economy. Ideas that help explain how markets shape, limit, and often dominate individual autonomy throughout history. In this work, Polanyi discusses the birthing of the mechanisms that shaped the capitalistic economy at least from the 16th to the 19th century England, suggesting that the start of the market pattern involved external trade and local trade, which were separate entities of the time. External and local trade were shaped by social norms, religious customs, and common law. These norms kept markets non-competitive and embedded in community values. The small towns in Europe during this time largely experienced these types of trade through reciprocity or social order. Local trade tends to involve trade and bartering within your community, and through social conditioning, through religion or social norms that maintains a non-competitive exchange of goods. If you needed bread, you'd go to the local baker, who might offer it at a socially acceptable price, or let you run a tab knowing you'd return with crops or carpentry skills. On the other hand, external trade sometimes relied on piracy or force to secure resources, but more often it ended in negotiated reciprocity. Throughout history, many communities engaged in this kind of exchange. If, for example, you needed something valuable, like sap from a certain tree, your neighboring community would likely expect a fair trade in return, rather than resorting to theft, or at least that was the hope. These kinds of trade are an early form of economies being embedded in social relations, and the very social fabric of pre-industrial society. But as new ways to trade and accumulate resources emerged, the economy began to disembed itself in social relations as mercantilism began to proliferate, and foreign merchants were more than willing to not abide by the price stability in municipalities and towns. This largely started to change as competition emerged with the introduction of products by foreign merchants not concerned with the bartering and trade in these towns, and they also have no need to adjust accordingly. This was prioritized as merchants saw that wealth was an increasingly feasible prospect and they have no inherent ties to any local market. As time went and wealth accumulated, this form of economic growth was seen as something that can be harnessed by the states. As these centralized states emerged, a new kind of national trade began to shape. Unlike local or external trade, this form was shaped by state interventions, driven by elites who saw the potential to accumulate capital on a national scale. This led to the commercial revolution as nations were forced to nationalize their markets to increase trade and commerce, which in turn left the guild system that provided local towns with materials to become vessels for capital and a tool to increase their output for export, leading nations down a path of invested capital interests that lacked any guarantee of industry permanency. This freeing of trade by mercantilism merely liberated trade from particularism, but at the same time extended the scope of regulation. In other words, markets were no longer confined by local restrictions, but they became increasingly shaped by national policies designed to support capital accumulation. The rise of the self-regulating market during the late 18th to late 19th centuries was a period marked by the growing influence of economic liberalism. The classical components of liberalism, the labor market, the gold standard, and free trade were molded as instruments for states to begin trading with one another and building wealth on a global scale. The objective for these markets were to not just regulate trade, but to subject everything within the market to be available for trade. For the market to be truly self-regulating, it had to turn everything into a commodity, including things that were never meant to be bought or sold. Polanyi called these fictitious commodities labor, land, and money. Human beings, nature, and currency were folded into market logic, a maneuver that was never particularly natural and is one of the earliest ways the market began to hollow out individual autonomy. By quantifying a person by their labor, it further classified them as a product in society. During this time, protectionism wasn't discarded. As early as 1800, export restrictions were still in use to maintain domestic industry even at the expense of pure profit. This was one of the early contradictions in the self-regulating market system. Freedom of exchange, what liberal economists championed, often proved more threatening than helpful. What the market actually demanded was freedom from regulation that restricted accumulation, not necessarily freedom in any egalitarian sense. In the utilitarian view, economic liberalism was considered useful because it claimed to benefit society through increased prosperity. But to make it work, the state had to remove itself from economic obligations while still fulfilling the structural requirements that laissez-faire demanded, which wasn't some neutral process. The push for laissez-faire came from specific class interests, mainly industrial capitalists and merchants, who had the most to gain from a market no longer bound by custom ethics or communal values. And they didn't just benefit. They utilized the tools of legislation to ensure regulations were written in their favor. Toward the late 1800s, a narrative was constructed, a kind of crusade by economic liberals against what they saw as anti-liberal legislation. These liberals argued that laissez-faire was a natural development, while anti-laissez-faire policies were artificial, a contradiction in their own reasoning. This is where Polanyi's double movement comes into play. Laissez-faire was not natural or spontaneous. It had to be engineered and maintained through legal structures. And as it began to unravel, efforts to protect society emerged in response. But the damage was already underway. The rise of the market economy caused massive social dislocation. Unions and monopolies, although on opposite ends of the economic spectrum, were both seen as threats to the self-regulating market. In response, legislation was introduced not to abolish the market, but to preserve it by limiting its most disruptive tendencies. These acts of preservation involved introducing social protections and factory acts for workers like chimney sweeps and child laborers. These reforms weren't efforts towards true collectivism or any restriction of capital. They were about maintaining the liberalism in a way that appeared less insidious. This collective response didn't originate from radical movements per se. It became a shared impulse across nations facing similar disruptions. This anti-liberal conspiracy, as Polanyi calls it, wasn't a political plot, but a social necessity. It became clear that laissez-faire had never been a passive unfolding of history. It was built, and ultimately it had to be restrained. And this is where neoliberalism was born, an ideology that, as Polanyi puts it, will unhesitatingly call for the intervention of the state in order to establish the self-regulating market, and once established, will maintain it. In other words, the market wasn't free. It was engineered and protected by the very institutions it claimed to resist. Polanyi laid out key aspects of economic and market structures that emerged from liberalism and later neoliberalism that shaped contemporary notions of individualism. During the rise of market economies in 19th century England and beyond, liberals began to see kinship, neighborhood, and religious community as obstacles to the kind of freedom they envisioned, one centered around the autonomous economic individual. To achieve this, communal ties had to be dismantled. Workers were sold the idea that labor was a pathway to freedom, that by selling their labor on the market, they could become self-made and independent. But unfortunately, this was a lie, weaponized to coerce people into participating in a system that had no interest in their well-being. Polanyi points to communal land systems among Nguni-speaking peoples such as the Zulu and Xhosa in southern Africa, where needs were met collectively and issues like starvation or homelessness were almost non-existent, precisely because land and labor weren't treated as commodities. For liberals, this was intolerable. Starvation had to exist, not as an accident, but as a disciplinary tool to ensure people would enter the labor market as willing workers. Thus, the willing worker wasn't a natural economic subject, but a manufactured one, created to serve the needs of the market system. This raises an important question. Who resisted this neoliberal transformation, and how? This is where the Owenite and Chartist movements come in. In mid-19th century England, these movements sought to reclaim power for the working class through cooperative economic models for Owenism and demands for universal political enfranchisement for Chartism. They were part of a broader counter-movement to re-embed the economy and social relations and restore dignity and agency to the individual. But over time, these efforts were diffused or absorbed. As the state began offering limited social protections, it simultaneously weakened collective institutions like unions and co-ops that had once fostered working class solidarity. The idea of the factory job as a path to upward mobility took hold, seducing generations into believing that selling their labor was a form of individual empowerment and not a system that commodified their existence. In reality, labor under capitalism was never a path to freedom, but a mechanism of control. The individual was promised autonomy, but in practice became just another input, no more valued than a faulty machine. These transformations didn't stop at England's borders. In fact, the market logic that took root there was exported across the globe, and nowhere did it take deeper hold than in the United States. So while Britain industrialized, America mythologized. The self-made man, the frontier cowboy, the entrepreneur. These were not merely cultural archetypes. They were capitalist dreams wrapped in individualist language. But unlike England, where communal traditions had to be actively dismantled, the US was a settler colony built on the idea of individual conquest from the beginning. Here, individualism became spiritual and exists outside the realm of economics, a moral obligation, a way to erase the collective in favor of competition and accumulation. So when Polanyi talked about how the market disembedded individuals from social life, in America that disembedding became a kind of national religion. But what happens when that religion becomes law? When identity, freedom, and self-worth are all mediated by how well you perform in the market? In the 21st century, American individualism doesn't just ask us to be free. It demands that we prove we deserve it. And if we fail, that's on us and our sole failure in the system. This brings us to the start of America's rapid ascent to being a world power. After World War I, the United States emerged not just as a military power, but as an economic empire. Mass production, rising wages, a booming middle class, The world watched as America became a symbol of opportunity, and with that came the myth that anyone, no matter where they started, could make it. This was the golden age of the American individual. From 1914 to 2000, the US went from an emerging industrial power to the dominant force in the global economy. And along the way, it crafted a story that if you worked hard, stayed disciplined, and followed the rules, you could make it. World War I kicked off the transformation. America became the world's top lender and its factories boomed. The roaring 20s exploded with cars, radios, and advertising, promising prosperity just a paycheck away. Then came the Great Depression, and with it, the New Deal, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and public jobs, not to challenge capitalism, but to keep it alive. World War II fully launched the US into superpower status. With factories humming and women and minorities joining the workforce, the economy took off, and after the war, so did the suburbs. The GI Bill gave veterans homes and college degrees, birthing the myth of the middle class as a reward for sacrifice. By the 1950s and 60s, wages were high, unemployment was low, and America's built highways, corporations, and a national brand. This was peak consumer capitalism, and the perfect breeding ground for the idea that success was personal. But by the 1980s, the game started changing. Deregulation and tax cuts made Wall Street the new frontier. Here is where the fictitious commodity thrived, where anything and everything could be bought if the price is right. The individual just needs to labor, to bear children, to go to war, to experience hardship at the expense of the economy, because the coattails of the American dream was always within arm's reach, or so we were told. American individualism tells us we all start the same, that with hard work and discipline, we'll rise. One of the most concrete ways this myth of individual success falls apart is through the steady erosion of ownership. But that's just the start. Neoliberal individualism doesn't just fail to deliver on its promises. It produces three major consequences that actively work against real autonomy: the loss of ownership, the rise of capital accrual as the dominant ideology, and the replacement of identity with performance. Neoliberal individualism promises that if you work hard enough, you can own a home, own a business, build a life. But in reality, ownership has become increasingly out of reach for millions of Americans. According to the National Association of Realtors' 2003 housing report, which examined racial disparities in home ownership since the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the home ownership rate for white Americans was about 72%, while for black Americans it was only 45%. That gap is actually wider than it was over 50 years ago, showing that systematic barriers to ownership haven't gone away. And it's not just race. Class plays a massive role too. The Pew Research Center, drawing from Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis data, found that average rent prices in the U.S. increased by 18% between 2017 and 2022, while wages stayed flat. So people are paying more, owning less, and getting locked out of one of the most basic forms of wealth accumulation. When you don't own your home, your software, your car, when you're renting your entire life, how can you claim agency? How can you be an individual in the way neoliberalism demands? All the risk is yours, but none of the security. That's how individualism ends up producing the exact opposite of what it promises. You're not free. You're dependent, not on community, but on markets and what they sell you. And this is the problem. People are taught to see this condition as an opportunity, that if they hustle hard enough, they too can become a landlord, a boss, a passive income earner. Capital accrual becomes the ideology itself. The person renting an overpriced apartment is told the real path to success is to buy a second home and rent it out to someone else. The goal shifts from stability to leverage in order to profit off of someone else's lack of it. That logic is everywhere, in YouTube ads, in the entrepreneur mindset, pushed on social media, in real estate influencers selling landlord courses. Passive income has become the holy grail. But passive for whom? The person collecting rent isn't doing the work, they're profiting from someone else's inability to own. And in this worldview, labor doesn't matter unless it turns into capital. You're told your time is only valuable if it's monetized, if it scales. That's not individualism, that's commodification. And it separates people from their labor, their community, and themselves. Which brings us to the third consequence, performative identity. If the only way to prove your value is through capital, then identity itself becomes a product. Every political position, every aesthetic, every rebellion gets commodified. Punk, goth, hip-hop, even queer culture, these begin as authentic expressions of community or resistance. But then they get stripped down and repackaged into something marketable. Performative identity isn't just about branding, it's about erasure. It's about substituting the real person for a marketable persona. Even rebellion becomes an accessory. You can perform outrage, but only in ways that don't disrupt the market. You can be radical as long as it's profitable. According to a study by USC Annenberg and ACC think tank, 74% of Gen Z say their buying decisions are directly influenced by brands understanding and catering to their many interests and identities in a way that makes them feel special. This research, which involved a survey of over 2,000 Gen Z adults, examines how deeply identity-based marketing shapes consumer behavior, reflecting that identity itself has become something you shop for. And in that sense, you don't become someone, you buy the performance of that someone. That's what neoliberal individualism does. It strips the soul out of the individual and replaces it with a product, a role to perform, a brand to maintain, a hustle to pursue. And in that performance, the true individual, the person embedded in a community shaped by care and interdependence, disappears. As Murray Bookchin, an American social theorist and political philosopher, put it in his 1995 lecture, The Forms of Freedom, who the hell ever wore boots in the summertime? But all of this is meant to make us interesting to ourselves because we're so hollowed out by the breakdown of community. We cover ourselves up with different hairstyles, with different styles of clothing, just to feel something. Bookchin here wasn't critiquing fashion, he was pointing to the deeper consequences of a society where individual identity is replaced with performance, and where true community has been gutted by consumer culture. The purpose of this video is to not just diagnose the crisis of individualism, but to explore what reclaiming the individual might actually look like. And for that, we turn to the Ecology of Freedom, where Bookchin proposes a radical reimagining of society, one rooted in decentralization, direct democracy, and ecological interdependence, a vision in which individuals don't perform identities to survive in the market, but flourish in communities built on mutual aid and genuine self-expression. To really talk about reclaiming the individual, we have to think through the tension between how society functions now and what it actually means to be free. Bookchin's not focused on going backward to some primitive way of life, he's not romanticizing tribal society. What he's doing is trying to understand how domination and hierarchy became so embedded in both the way we treat each other and the way we interact with the environment. And from there, he starts asking what would change if we began to dismantle those systems. Bookchin's framework, which he calls social ecology, is built around the idea that the domination of nature by man is directly connected to the domination of human by human. If we want to understand how the individual gets stripped down and commodified under capitalism and neoliberalism, it helps to trace how this logic of domination developed and how it's sustained. One thing that stands out in the Ecology of Freedom is how he challenges the idea that hierarchy is natural. We often project our own systems of control onto the animal world. We talk about alpha males or call lions the king of the jungle or interpret cooperative behaviors through a lens of competition and power. But that's us transcribing our society into something else. It's not an accurate representation of how ecosystems function. The way we interpret the natural world is shaped by the society we live in. And when that society is organized around hierarchy, we start to assume that hierarchy exists everywhere, that it's universal. That's a problem, because once we internalize that, it becomes harder to see that so much of what we take for granted is constructed. We end up accepting conditions that were built and maintained for the benefit of certain groups as if they were inevitable. This is part of how individuality becomes hollowed out. It gets turned into performance and consumption, rather than something that grows through relationships, reflection, and community. So what does Bookchin propose instead? He lays out a few principles that he believes could support a more liberatory and ecological society. Usufruct, complementarity, and the irreducible minimum. Usufruct is about use rather than ownership. It's the idea that people should be able to use what they need, especially if those resources exist in excess, without requiring individual ownership. That doesn't mean nobody owns anything. It's about moving away from the idea that all resources have to be held privately in order to have value. It points toward community resource sharing and undermines the logic of accumulation. Complementarity is the idea that differences between people don't need to lead to hierarchies. Different roles, abilities, or personalities can coexist in a society without being ranked. A carpenter and a physician have different functions, but both matter. Complementarity values these differences for what they are, not for what they can earn. This view challenges the capitalist notion that value is determined solely by how much something can be bought or sold for. The irreducible minimum is the basic guarantee that every person should have access to the necessities of life, food, clean water, shelter, healthcare, without having to prove themselves deserving. It's not just about meeting survival needs, but creating a foundation that allows people to actually participate, to grow, and to express themselves beyond just struggling to get by. In that sense, it's a condition for the development of the individual, not a limitation on it. Bookchin doesn't arrive at these ideas out of thin air. His thinking is informed by earlier socialist experiments, especially the Owenite movement and Charles Fourier's concept of the phalanstery. The Owenites, as touched on earlier, tried to rebuild a more rational and egalitarian society, especially in response to the conditions of early industrial capitalism. Bookchin respects the intention but critiques the way their visions still relied heavily on industrial rationality. Their focus on order and efficiency ended up suppressing creativity and individual expression. In Bookchin's view, they didn't go far enough in reimagining the role of the individual within the community. Charles Fourier, on the other hand, took a different approach. His idea of the phalanstery was centered around pleasure, spontaneity, and free cooperation. Rather than designing society as a machine to be managed, Fourier wanted a community where people could live in ways that aligned with their desires and personalities. He rejected patriarchal structures and envisioned social arrangements that supported rather than suppressed human passion. Bookchin draws heavily from this, not just for the social vision, but for the emphasis on desire and imagination as essential parts of human freedom. That's what makes Bookchin's view of individuality different from what we see under neoliberalism. In our current system, individuality is usually about branding and self-promotion. You're told to turn your personality into a product, your talents into services, and your hobbies into income streams. But that's not autonomy. That's a narrow kind of survival that demands you fit yourself into whatever the market will buy. Bookchin argues that true individuality can only emerge within a society that provides the space for it to grow. That means structures that support care, shared responsibility, and democratic participation. It's not about choosing the collective and the individual, it's about creating the conditions where people can be themselves without being reduced to their labor or their marketability. That's why he pushes for decentralization and direct democracy. When people can participate in the decisions that affect them, not just vote every few years, but actually shape the structures around them, they become more capable of exercising real agency. The self isn't found in isolation. It's found through participation and through being recognized as part of something larger that doesn't erase you. One of the most important parts of the ecology of freedom is where Bookchin talks about how the loss of individuality is tied to the breakdown of community. He writes that as people lose meaningful relationships, as communal ties disappear, and as decision-making is handed off to distant bureaucracies or private institutions, people don't become more unique. They become more alienated. And what often replaces this is performance. The market gives us tools to simulate individuality, fashion, social media, consumer choice, but that's not the same as agency or self-direction. Bookchin isn't arguing for a return to the past. He makes it clear that this isn't about retribalization. He uses the word recommunalization, a deliberate construction of community, built with an understanding of where older forms of society both succeeded and failed. It's about learning from history without trying to recreate it. What he's offering is a way to reconnect social life to ethical life, where participation, care, and mutual responsibility aren't distractions from individuality, but the ground it grows from. Underlying all of this is a challenge to how we think about labor, value, and what it means to live a meaningful life. Bookchin doesn't give a blueprint, but he outlines the ways systems of domination shape not just policy, but how we see ourselves. And to get out of that, we have to shift our framework. That includes how we think about ecology, and the use of technology, and about the kinds of relationships we want to have, both with each other and with the environment. What matters here isn't just critique, it's the possibility that we don't have to accept commodified individuality or competitive survival as a limit of what society can offer. There's space for something else, something that doesn't strip people down or force them into categories built around productivity and performance. Bookchin's work helps us see how things could be different, but more importantly, it reminds us that who we are isn't fixed by the market, and that individuality doesn't have to mean isolation. It can mean contribution, creativity, responsibility, and a deeper connection to the people and the world around us. Maybe it's time we stop rallying around the idea of individualism and start rallying around the individual.